Yes, I appreciate Lauren telling you that he had in effect commissioned this. That's why I call this here not only my task, but my commission. Um, this is not necessarily in my wheelhouse to deal with, but I had dealt with part of this before, as you'll see in a moment. We'll have an introduction, talk about origin development of the doctrine of the investigative judgment, look at Ellen White's uh, trajectory of ideas. Fundamental belief 24 is where the investigative judgment is found in the Adventist fundamental belief statements. We'll look at specifically the question of asset or liability under the heading of current status. There'll be a conclusion and a discussion. So, in general, then, my task or my commission is to consider the Adventist doctrine of the investigative judgment, but in particular, to discuss the origin and development of the doctrine, Ellen White, Fundamental Belief 24, and its current status within Adventism. Part of this presentation appeared in an article that I did for Spectrum, ominously on the 22nd of October, 2024, it appeared. That's why I put that in bold here. It was entitled A Focused Study of the Official Text, and it should have said biblical texts of the sanctuary belief. I want to mention several people whose publications I found helpful, and I indicate here the areas of study that I particularly focused on with them. Glenn Hansen, Anthony McPherson, who wrote a comprehensive article about this in the Online Adventist Encyclopedia. Fernand Feisel and Brian Strayer dealing with Hiram Edson, Bob Olson on Ellen White's contributions, Ray Cottrell, and Don Casebold. So to the introduction, the most unique and characteristic teaching of Seventh-day Adventists is the doctrine of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary and its seemingly indispensable component, the investigative judgment. This doctrine constitutes the reinterpreted link of Sabbatarian Adventism to its Millerite roots, especially to the central contention of the latter concerning the expected second advent of Jesus at the perceived termination of the prophecy in Daniel 8:14. There, something is to occur at the end of 2,300 days. More precisely, the text refers to 2,300 evenings and mornings. Through a convoluted understanding of days equals years and a flawed King James Version translation, the Millerites had proclaimed that Jesus would return in the mid-1840s. They eventually settled on a specific date, as you know, 22 October 1844, which, to their great disappointment and shame, came and went like any other day. In the understandable confusion, a small group of Millerites became convinced that the biblical text, which they thought correctly pointed to 22 October 1844, had something else in mind. Instead of returning to the earth as expected, on that date, Jesus transitioned from the heavenly counterpart of the Israelite holy place to the most holy place to begin a judgment event they associated with the ancient Day of Atonement. That is to say, a judgment of the righteous, an investigative judgment. Looking a bit at origin and development, I start with what I call here embryonic Millerite roots. The investigative judgment was not logically required in Millerite theology, although preliminary elements of a pre-Advent judgment may be found there without the expression investigative judgment. For example, Josiah Litch in 1841 wrote in an article, nor is there a text which presents the judicial scene of judgment after the resurrection. On the contrary, the scriptures can be harmonized on no other principle than that every man's doom is fixed before his resurrection. So that kind of connotes a pre-Advent judgment without a particular kind of focus on the investigative aspect of it. Some disappointed Millerites concluded that on 22 October, Jesus, the bridegroom, arrived at the wedding. This was based on their understanding of the parable in Matthew 25. Arrived at the wedding to receive his kingdom, at which time there was a judgment of God's people and a corresponding short delay in his second advent. So they anticipated that he would come soon after that, even though he didn't come on that day. This was quickly abandoned in favor of the notion that Jesus had returned to the earth, not physically, but spiritually. The key figure in the transition from the traditional Millerite ideas to the notion of investigative judgment among Sabbatarian Adventists was O.R.L. Crozier. Originally, his name was spelled with a Z, and I use it throughout here for the most part. In Adventist literature, he tends to show up as Crozier with an S. He was a Millerite figure who had correspondence with Sabbatarian Adventists, particularly on this point, but never officially joined them. Although focused primarily on issues of typology, Crozier in 1845 and 6 shifted the emphasis to the typical Day of Atonement, typical used here in the sense of based on types, and concluded that the sanctuary cleansing in the King James language of Daniel 8:14 referred to the heavenly sanctuary and not to its earthly counterpart. Accordingly, once the brief work of Christ in heaven's most holy place was complete, he would return to the earth. Crozier, who was alleged to have collaborated with Hiram Edson, later repudiated the doctrine. Now, speaking of Edson, here's the famous picture. It was done in color, but I couldn't find a version of it that I could legally use. And so I used this monochrome, which gets the idea across. It's Harry Anderson's famous picture of Edson in the cornfield in 1940. That is, the painting is from 1944. It is interesting, as we'll see, that when Hiram Edson finally got around to talking about this, he didn't mention a cornfield. He talked simply about a large field. So here's the legend then, and what we make of it. The legend of Hiram Edson goes something like this. Early on 23 October 1844, Edson and Crozier walked across a cornfield. As Edson reported at least 23 years later, quote, "I was stopped midway of the field. Heaven seemed open to my view, and I saw distinctly and clearly that instead of our high priest coming out of the most holy of the heavenly sanctuary at the end of the 2300 days, that he, for the first time, entered on that day the second apartment of that sanctuary, and that he had a work to perform in the most holy before coming to the earth." Now, here's a kind of reality check. Between the years 1849 and 1867, Edson wrote two pamphlets, 20 articles, and sent 20 letters or reports to the Present Truth or the Review and Herald, none of which referred to his cornfield experience or focused on the Day of Atonement, the investigative judgment, or Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. During the 1850s, the task of explaining the group's views on the heavenly sanctuary fell to 6 people. Crozier, with 6 articles, James White, 6, J.N. Andrews, 9 articles, Uriah Smith, 20 articles, Charles Sperry, 1, and Elon Everett, 2 short letters or articles to the Review. Then between the years 1861 and 1876, At least 96 additional articles on the heavenly sanctuary appeared in the Review and Herald. 56 of these were by Uriah Smith, who most of that time was its editor. The remaining 40 by Joseph Wagner, but none by Hiram Edson. In fact, as we noted briefly before we started today, it was not until the mid-20th century that Edson's cornfield legend was launched by Arthur W. Spaulding in his books in 1947, 49, and the multi-volume Origin and History of Seventh-day Adventists, 1961 to 62. Spaulding thereby placed Edson on par with James and Ellen White, Joseph Bates, J. N. Andrews, and other early pioneers as a key figure in the discovery and development of this central Adventist doctrine. Adventists adopt eventually, of course, this investigative judgment understanding of the sanctuary teaching. It began somewhat, as far as I can tell, somewhat tangentially in 1854. John Loughborough, when discussing in an article, Daniel 8:14, he asked and answered his own question. The question was, what was that work of cleansing? And he answered by saying that it was a work of judgment. Now we'll talk more about the idea of cleansing and the legitimacy or lack thereof of using that term and translating part of Daniel 8 with that language. But that was how it was understood in those days, and in fact, how it continues to be understood in Adventism today. In a letter dated 17 December 1856, 2 years after Loughborough was posing and answering the question, a letter that was published a few days later in the Adventist Review, January 1 of 1857, Elon Everett, a minor figure, lay leader in the church at the time, appears to be the first to use the expression investigative judgment. And he followed this up with a letter of his on the 4th of June, 1857, which the Review published 7 days later, a little more comprehensive statement. It's interesting. I got really quite excited about this when I discovered it, because the Review dates his letter as 1854. And I thought, wow, this goes back to the time, or if not before, of J.M. Loughborough. And the Review doesn't get around to publishing it until 1857. The more I looked into it, I discovered, to my disappointment, that this letter was actually written, that it should have read 1857, not 1854, on the part of Elon Everett. I won't go into the reason for that, but it's quite obvious that that was the case. This was just inadvertently indicated as 1854. Anyway, in 1857, we have a letter then published on the 1st of January that Elon Everett had submitted to the Review, and he references investigative judgment. A few weeks later, James White, the Review and Herald editor at the time, who had previously opposed this doctrine, fully supported it, including the expression investigative judgment, in a long article that he published on the 29th of January of that same year. By then, the die was cast. The investigative judgment has been the centerpiece of Adventist theology ever since. And so the doctrine of the investigative judgment then began to appear in lists of Adventist beliefs. The first such list of any comprehensive nature came out in 1872, and this doctrine was part of it. It was subsequently involved as a separate or included faith statement in 1874, 89, 1931, 41, 50, 80, and is the current language of the version that now dates from 2005. We'll look at that in just a moment. But first of all, let's stay with that early period and look a little bit at Ellen White. In the Day Star, a sort of post-Millerite or maybe continuously Millerite publication, 1846, Ellen wrote, God showed me the following. 1 year ago this month, so this would have been in 1845, I saw a throne, and on it sat the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. I saw the Father rise from the throne and in a flaming chariot go into the Holy of Holies within the veil and did sit. And I saw a cloudy chariot with wheels like flaming fire. Angels were all about the chariot as it came where Jesus was. He stepped into it and was borne to the holiest where the Father sat. Now, I don't know how the chariot was moved. Was it self-propelled? Was it pulled by oxen or horses or angels or what? Don't know. This, just a little note on this, in this same lengthy letter that Ellen White wrote at that time, she talked about the fact that that Satan was in the holy place with the Father and the Son before this. And when the Father left and the Son left, Satan stayed there. And, there was this idea in Adventist theology at the time, Sabbatarian Adventist theology, of following Christ into the heavenly sanctuary. Those who chose not to follow him there, presumably meaning they didn't believe in that teaching, when they prayed, their prayers went into the holy place, which was the last place they assumed Jesus was. And their prayers then were received by Satan, and he answered them. Not always in the way that they would have wanted, but it is an interesting element that was part of this at the time. 12 years later, Ellen White wrote her first substantial book, which we call now Spiritual Gifts, Book 1. It had a longer title than that, including The Language of Great Controversy and so on. But that came out in 1858. Shortly after the vision she said she received in Lovett's Grove, Ohio, dealing with the Great Controversy. So she wrote at that time, as the priests in the earthly sanctuary entered the most holy place once a year to cleanse the sanctuary, Jesus entered the most holy of the heavenly at the end of 2300 days of Daniel 8 in 1844 to make a final atonement for all who could be benefited by his mediation and to cleanse the sanctuary. I saw that every case was then decided for life or death. Jesus had blotted out the sins of his people while Jesus had been ministering in the sanctuary. The judgment had been going on for the righteous dead and then for the righteous living. In 1884, in the last of 4 volumes that constitute the set called Spirit of Prophecy, this is sort of the forerunner of the book of the Great Controversy, which came out in 1888 and then revised in 1911. She wrote there, the subject of the sanctuary and investigative judgment should be clearly understood by the people of God. All need a knowledge for themselves of the position and work of their great high priest. Otherwise, it will be impossible for them to exercise the faith essential at this time or to occupy the position which God designs them to fill. It is of the utmost importance that all who have received the light, both old and young, should thoroughly investigate these subjects. That's an interesting use of the word investigate there. And to be able to give an answer to everyone that asketh. She apparently still spoke Elizabethan English sometimes. Them a reason of the hope that is in them. About 9 years before she died, she wrote in a letter, 1906, the truths given us after the passing of the time in 1844 are just as certain and unchangeable as when the Lord gave them to us in answer to our urgent prayers. Now, I might stop here and say, what were the truths given them with the passing of the time? Well, it was that the date was right. The Millerites had that right. That was part of the truths that she said were given to them, and then the re-understanding of them by what eventually became Sabbatarian Adventists about the role of Jesus in the heavenly sanctuary and the judgment associated with it. So I continue then. At that time, one error after another pressed in upon us. Ministers and doctors brought in new doctrines. I think with regard to the doctors, she's probably thinking more of her own time. There weren't any physicians that I know of that were part of it in 1844. We would search the scriptures with much prayer, and the Holy Spirit would bring the truth to our minds. Sometimes whole nights would be devoted in searching the scriptures and earnestly asking God for guidance. Companies of devoted men and women assembled for this purpose. Now notice this last sentence. The power of God would come upon me. That's upon Ellen. And I was enabled clearly to define what is truth and what is error. That, I think, is a very unique statement of Ellen White. She probably said that a few times, but this stood out to me as I read this, because typically Ellen would not engage in doctrinal controversies. We read things about her associated with 1888, for example, where she tends to say that kind of thing. She wouldn't take a position on the law in Galatians quite typically. Wanted people to work this out with their own biblical study. Here, she says, we couldn't come up with this by searching the scriptures, even all night, and the power of God would come upon her, and she would sort it out for them, what was truth and what was error. Well, let's look at Fundamental Belief 24 now. This begins sort of a look at the current situation, because this is the last statement that we have. Now, this is not a doctrine, 24 is not a doctrine that is uniquely focused on the investigative judgment. It's called Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. What I've highlighted here is the language within FB 24 that deals with the investigative judgment. Let me just read the first part of it, and then I'll kind of skip into the highlighted material. So there is a sanctuary in heaven, a true tabernacle, which the Lord set up and not man. This is language she's taking from the letter to the Hebrews. Christ ministers there on our behalf. And then she goes to, I'll jump down to the highlighted part now. It is a work of investigative judgment, which is part of the ultimate disposition of all sin, typified by the cleansing of the ancient Hebrew sanctuary on the Day of Atonement. We'll examine the veracity of that statement. Then it jumps to say, the investigative judgment reveals to heavenly intelligences who among the dead are asleep in Christ, and therefore in him are deemed worthy to have part in the first resurrection. It also makes manifest who among the living are abiding in Christ, keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And in him, therefore, are ready for translation into his everlasting kingdom. This judgment vindicates the justice of God in saving those who believe in Jesus. It declares that those who have remained loyal to God shall receive the kingdom. The completion of his ministry, of this ministry of Christ, will mark the close of human probation. That's the last part. And then there's a series of biblical texts appended here, cited here. And some of those deal with the investigative judgment, I think. And so we'll look at those. Now, just my calculation, 48.4% of Fundamental Belief 24, in other words, the material above that is highlighted, deals with the investigative judgment. So this is deemed to be a major element of it, obviously. So let's look at it, the language, first of all. It's a work of investigative judgment. So in underlined and with italics are the expressions found in FB 24 that we've just read. My comments are below each one. Not only is the expression investigative judgment not found in the Bible, but also the notion of judgment is nowhere linked to the services of the sanctuary, earthly or celestial. And this includes Leviticus and Hebrews. So it goes on to say, an investigative judgment, which is part of the ultimate disposition of all sin. Well, my comment is that none of the biblical descriptions of the activities of the high priest, earthly or celestial, involve judgment, let alone investigative judgment. This includes Leviticus and Hebrews. As we've noted, the work of the high priest in the most holy place of the earthly sanctuary is not a work of investigative judgment, as claimed in the statement. The statement includes the language that this is typified by the cleansing of the ancient Hebrew sanctuary on the Day of Atonement. Well, the notion of cleansing the earthly sanctuary is not found, interestingly enough, in Leviticus 16, where the Day of Atonement is described in detail, and its services and activities. The idea of cleansing, I have the Hebrew word here, is associated there only with the altar that is before the Lord in verses 18 and 19, and is reflected in the New Revised Standard Version that way. Cleansing is also associated with the worshiper in one place in verse 30. The chapter instead uses the word atonement, kefir, regarding Aaron and his successor priests in at least 4 places, the holy place in several places, Aaron's household, the altar that is before the Lord, the holy sanctuary, the tabernacle of the congregation, and for the priests and all the congregation of Israel. So there's no notion of the earthly sanctuary being cleansed. There's different language that's used with regard to the impact on those centers. The investigative judgment reveals to heavenly intelligences, the fundamental belief declares. Well, who are these heavenly intelligences, and why do they need to know anything about dead and living believers at the end time? More importantly, what is the biblical evidence for this assertion? There is none. The supporting texts don't even include 1 Corinthians 4:9, which talks about becoming a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to mortals. But of course, that text is referring to what Paul calls us apostles, and not to those who successfully negotiate the investigative judgment. And then there's a kind of a long quote from the statement, which says, who among the dead, that is to say, who among the dead in Christ are deemed to be worthy, and so forth. The language is from Revelation 14:12 concerning keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, reflects the King James Version, those who observe these things. They are simply, however, observant Christians. Seventh-day Adventists, of course, typically focus only on the 4th commandment in the former descriptor, even though it's not mentioned specifically. In him, therefore, they are ready for translation. That's a very interesting term, isn't it? Into his everlasting kingdom. That expression, translation, is never used, even in the King James Bible, for living end-time believers, as it is used by Adventists. Hebrews 11:5 draws on Sirach 44:16 and refers to Enoch being, quote, translated by God. And that before that translation, a similar verb is used there, not the same one. His reputation was that he pleased God. The only other New Testament use in the King James of translate is Colossians 1:13, which states that he, the Father, hath delivered us from the power of darkness and hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. So this translation there does deal with the people of God. The problem for using this text for the purposes cited here is that this is seen as a contemporary or already completed action. It's a present reality, not something that takes place at the end of time. The writer in Colossians clearly makes that statement. More important, neither of these synonymous Greek verbs carry the notion of translation in the New Revised Standard Version. So then the judgment is said to vindicate, this investigative judgment, to vindicate the justice of God in saving people who believe in Jesus. So now the investigative judgment that was to be centered on dead and living believers to determine their fitness for resurrection and translation morphs into a vindication of God's justice in saving them. However, no matter how creative this bifurcated understanding may be, there's no biblical evidence for either of these assertions. And then finally, it declares, that is, the investigative judgment declares that those who have remained loyal to God shall receive the kingdom. Well, here we flip back to the focus on the believers, but with no more veracity. So there are a number of texts that are appended here, I describe these, not only the ones I'm going to talk about here, but others as well that make up the whole list in the article that I noted at the beginning. These texts start with two texts that are well known, the so-called year-day or day-year principle texts, Numbers 14:34, Ezekiel 4:6. One is a day-year principle that for every day that the spies were out wandering around in the land of Canaan, and after they came back with their report and people didn't believe them, believe that they could take the land, God said, well, for every day that they've been gone, you have to spend a year in the wilderness, so 40 years. So that's a principle that moves from one day equals a year. But Ezekiel 4:6 talks about the reverse. There the prophet is quite inexplicably told to lie on his left side for 390 days to bear the 390-year punishment of the house of Israel. And when he's finished with that, which is about 13 months, he was told to lie on the other side for 40 days to bear the 40-year punishment of the house of Judah. So in this case, it's a day leads to a year. The other one, a year leads to a day. The other one, the day leads to a year. But neither one of them talks about these as principles of understanding prophecies, especially time prophecies and so forth. And nobody seems to ever notice the fact that these are reversals of each other, and they somewhat cancel each other out. Well, we come to Daniel 7, cited there in verses 9 to 27. This text is likely cited to support divine judgment under the context of investigative judgment. However, that language is not used there. In fact, there doesn't even seem to be any content that is associated with investigation of God's people, nor indicating that it is to start at a specific time. It pertains to the judgment and destruction of the negative little horn. The holy ones are involved only as the object of violent harassment by the little horn, as benefactors of God's divine judgment on their behalf, presumably against the little horn, and as the eventual recipients of the kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven. In other words, the greatness of all of those contemporary kingdoms gets to be transferred to the saints, the holy ones here. This is not an investigative judgment of the holy ones, nor is it in any way reflective of a process to begin in AD 1844. Now here's the key text, I suppose, Daniel 8, 13, and 14. In verse 13, there is a question that is answered in verse 14. In the former, that is verse 13, one holy one asks another, how long the curtailment of the regular burnt offering, and the word used there in Hebrew is used regularly for the daily burnt offerings. How long will that curtailment last? It's going to be, put on hold or removed or something. How long will this condition exist? The answer comes back in verse 14, for 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices. You see, the burnt offerings are what are being asked about in verse 13. You would clearly expect verse 14 to refer in the answer to those as well. Now, the New Revised Standard Version translates this 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, evenings and mornings in the context of verse 13 must mean the evening and morning sacrifices. The King James translates this 2,300 days. Now, there's no reference in the Hebrew text to days at this point. It seems instead to be influenced by the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which translates it here as 2,300 evening, morning days. That's the literal translation of the Greek. The Hebrew implies 2,300 regular sacrifices, which with 2 per day would be 1,150 days. Even if the text implies 2,300 days, it would not mean 2,300 years. Verse 14 refers to a period of days, either 2,300 or more likely 1,150. This does not extend to AD 1844. The last part of verse 14 anticipates a positive outcome. And the Hebrew is given here, it's translated, and the sanctuary will be restored. The question asks, how long is it going to be desolated in a sense? The answer is quite understandably positive. It'll take this time and then it'll be restored. That is, it will resume its regular daily sacrifices. We can compare the NRSV that says, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. That's a little bit of a wordy translation, but it gets the idea across. The King James Bible says, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. The word cleansed is not used in this text in Hebrew. It is influenced by the Septuagint, which says, and the sanctuary will be cleansed. That's the Greek translation done probably about, somewhere between 50 and 130 years before the time of Jesus. The Adventist interpretation, based on the translation of the King James, which in turn was influenced by the Greek, implies that the sanctuary will be cleansed after 2,300 days, or as Adventists understand it, 2,300 years. Accordingly, this is seen not as a restoration of regular morning and evening sacrifices, as in the Hebrew text, but as the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, the celestial Day of Atonement. The text provides no evidence to support this reading. Verses 11 and 12, coming before this section, describe the curtailment of the regular burnt offerings. And verse 13 has the question about how long this condition will last. The Hebrew then in the text with the article in verse 13 has the article, it means the daily. You look up any competent lexicon of Hebrew, and it cites this text with an article as meaning the daily morning and evening burnt offering. There's no question about that. And it is used 3 times in that verb with that expression with the article, the, occurs 3 times in this little section. Anyway, there's some more stuff about numbers here that I'm just going to skip for sake of time. This then takes us to Daniel 9, which I think is very, very interesting. Daniel 9, 24 to 27. Verse 17, Daniel prays for God to shine his face, quote, upon your desolated sanctuary. Well, it's obvious what this means. This is talking about that desolation of the sanctuary from chapter 8, the curtailment of the daily sacrifices. And so this seems to be Daniel calling for a restoration of what was envisioned in chapter 8:14. The angel Gabriel here announces the plan in verses 24 to 27. 70 weeks, 490 days, or 1 year and 130 days are decreed for the people and the holy city to anoint a most holy place. Not entirely clear what that may mean, but it has to be understood within the context of the desolation of the sanctuary discussed in the earlier part of Daniel 8. So, from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, then, an anointed priest, the Hebrew says, an anointed prince will come. The King James Bible translates this inexplicably as Messiah, the prince, and capitalizes both Messiah and prince. Anyway, this period will be 7 weeks, 49 days. For 62 weeks, 340 days, Jerusalem, which is the focal point here, will be built and functioning. Remember, when this text is positioned in history, not necessarily when it was written, it's talking about a time when Jerusalem was desolated. Then an anointed prince will arise corresponding to the time of the city. I'm sorry, an anointed one. It just simply says an anointed one. And then a prince, using the same word as found in verse 25, and troops will come and destroy the city and sanctuary, but make a strong covenant for 1 week, 7 days. But for half the week, 3.5 days, he shall make sacrifice and offering cease. Presumably the offering and sacrifice had been restored. Now they're going to be curtailed again, and put in their place an abomination that desolates until the decreed end. Now, interestingly enough, I have the paragraph here, which I think is extremely important. You look back on the line that says, and the plan right here. Let me see if I can get my mouse to work. Yeah, you see right here, this is the word Mashiach, anointed, and then prince. Here's the same word down here, the word Mashiach, used 40 times in the Hebrew Bible, has the article ha-Mashiach, the anointed one, only in Leviticus 4 and 6, 4 times in Leviticus. And there it refers to the priest. So the priest is a Mashiach, an anointed one. The King James translated the word with some form of anointed in 38 cases, 38 of the 40 cases, referring to priests, prophets, kings, such as David, Saul and David, and even the Persian emperor Cyrus, mentioned in the book of Isaiah, are all described with the word Mashiach. They are therefore all anointed ones. So we have to expand our idea of anointed one here to some wide variety. 38 out of the 40 cases clearly refers to priests, prophets, 2 kings of Israel, and even a king of the Persians. But the King James Bible uses the word Messiah for Mashiach. It sounds like the word Messiah comes from anointed one, to be sure. It translates Messiah only in Daniel 7, 25 and 26. Its meaning in Daniel 9 should simply refer to an anointed person, as in the King James Bible, which could be any of these types listed here, or some other kind of leader who is not otherwise mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And that person is associated, one of them, with the rebuilding of the city. The other one is mentioned at the time of its demise again. So it's possibly 2 anointed persons in Daniel 7. However, the King James Bible, without any basis and without any justification, translates both of these references in Daniel 9. Actually, this should say Daniel 9, 25 and 26. I noticed this is wrong here. There's no basis for the term to be used here as Messiah, especially translated with a capital, capitalized like this, meaning quite clearly the Christ of Christianity. Yet Adventists not only follow the King James here, but also build a distinctive doctrine on this mistranslation. Anyway, some more on Daniel 9. Fundamental belief says nothing about the 70-week prophecy. I conclude here that it probably is listed simply because of the translation of the King James Bible, where it predicts the appearance of the Messiah after 69 weeks. And it's not Messiah's cut off and all of this. But this does not sound like a Messiah who comes with his troops and destroys the city, according to the text. So it is neither linguistically nor contextually sound to understand Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks as having any reference whatsoever to Jesus of Nazareth. Revelation 14, 6 and 7, this text is the so-called first angel's message, which along with verses 8 to 11 constitutes the three angels' messages, a virtual constitution for Seventh-day Adventists. This material includes the proclamation of the second and third angel, and it appears in Revelation 14 without a setting or literary connection to what precedes or follows it. It contains no indication that it describes the existence or activities of any particular group of people, and certainly not a special branch of Christianity in the end of time. The text is likely cited for its declaration at the end of the third message, the hour of, first letter, for a couple of reasons. Probably in the first message, verse 7, the hour of God's judgment has come. This is seen to be a proclamation that those who emerged out of Millerite teachings as Sabbatarian Adventists felt that they began with their predecessors, the Millerites, but then they are called upon to proclaim this dual meaning of God's investigative judgment of the dead and living believers and the judgment of God himself, God himself by the heavenly intelligences. None of this can reasonably derive from the sparse language of this text. Finally, Revelation 20, verse 12, this is another judgment scene, one where anachronistically record books, they're called, including the Book of Life from the celestial archives, are produced as evidence in the prosecution of the dead. But according to verse 7 of this chapter, the setting of this seems to be after the 1,000 years are ended. Therefore, it cannot be part of any investigative judgment. Well, quickly then, let me talk about the status, asset or liability. First of all, the challenge. This remains a challenge for us today, I think. And Ray Cottrell, one of the founders of Adventist Today, said this in 2001 in an unpublished statement. The traditional interpretation of Daniel 8:14 with its sanctuary and investigative judgment, which gave birth to Seventh-day Adventism and accounts for its existence as a distinct entity within Christianity, has been the object of more criticism and debate by both Adventists and non-Adventists than all other facets of its belief system combined. The same is true with respect to church discipline on doctrinal grounds, defections from the church, and the diversion of time, attention, and resources from Adventists' perceived mission to the world. That's the viewpoint of Ray Cottrell 24 years ago. Now, I set up this as a duality, an asset to be retained and restated, or, as we'll see, a liability to be abandoned and replaced. Let's look at the first of these. This is from an recent article by Dick Davidson that appeared in the Adventist Review just last fall. Davidson says, the three angels' messages of Revelation 14 present the pre-Advent judgment as an integral part of the gospel. Is the biblical message of the end-time investigative judgment really assuring good news? I've not always considered it good news, he says. The Bible consistently upholds the seriousness of sin and the certainty of judgment, but it also reveals that the judgment is good news. Now, how does he determine that? He says, in fact, I have found at least 7 scriptural reasons for joyous assurance in the judgment. Here they are. Christ is our substitute. Christ is our lawyer or advocate. Christ is the star witness on our behalf. Christ is our judge. Christ is our purifier. Christ is our vindicator. Up to this point, this is his doctrine of Christology is determining for him that this belief apparently is sound. But then he switches to the vindication of God, which comes from first angel's message, I guess, for him. But this, to me, makes little or no sense. Christ as substitute, okay, that might make some sense. but substitute and lawyer and star witness and judge and purifier, vindicator. There's no logical reason how one person, divine or otherwise, could in fact carry out all of these particular activities. Remember, this whole idea is a metaphor, investigative judgment. I was going to start this whole presentation out with the line from Law and Order that talks about the people have two systems. They talk about the police that investigate crime and the judicial system that punishes things. I reworded it in a little different way to reflect this. I decided to leave that out, but clearly, in the idea of the metaphor of investigative judgment could not, in any rational way, include all of these radically different and contradictory aspects of the ministry of Christ. But anyway, I'll leave that up to you. Similar efforts with different nuances of how to make sense out of this were attempted by Ed Heppenstall and more recently by Rick Rice. Here now is the other side of this. Not an asset to be retained and restated, but a liability to be abandoned and replaced. And we come back to Cottrell in the same article. He says, for about 40 years, the sanctuary doctrine raised no known eyebrows or protests, but on an average of every 15 or 20 years or so since 1887, an experienced, respected, and trusted church administrator or Bible teacher has called the attention of fellow church leaders to flaws in the traditional interpretation of Daniel 8:14, forfeited his ministerial credentials, and either been disfellowshipped or voluntarily left the church. And he cites the cases of D.M. Canwright, Ballinger, Fletcher, Conradi, Prescott, and Snide from 1887 to 1945. And he says this is even still going on today. When he wrote this, he could talk about Desmond Ford, Dale Ratzliff, Jerry Gladson, Janet Brown, and Don Silver. So his discussion of each of these people and their activities and their viewpoints and their fates constitutes a big chunk of his article. Well, Cottrell says his problems with the investigative judgment began in 1955 when he was writing the fourth volume of the Bible commentary and focused on Daniel. He, during that time, memorized a large chunk of the Hebrew text of the book of Daniel, the latter part of the book of Daniel. And he was also at the time working on a new edition of the periodically edited volume that most of you would recognize, Bible Readings for the Home Circle, typically just called Bible Readings. So in that process, he determined that the Adventist doctrine of the sanctuary and investigative judgment has no biblical support. And so he sent 6 questions concerning the doctrine to all North American Division College Old Testament teachers. We had no universities in those days. And people who were teaching Hebrew and so on, all replied that there was, quote, no linguistic or contextual basis for the traditional Adventist interpretation of Daniel 8:14. So Cottrell approached the General Conference leadership with this. They took it seriously and appointed, of course, as is typical, a committee. Cottrell describes the committee as a super secret committee on problems in the book of Daniel. This committee met from 1961 to 66, considered 48 papers, according to Cottrell, who was a member of it, and reached no consensus. Cottrell conducted his own comprehensive study of Daniel 7 to 12 from 1955 to 72 and concluded that, quote, our traditional interpretation of Daniel 8:14, the sanctuary and investigative judgment, as set forth in Article 23, now it's 24 by the addition of something new in 2005, Article 24 of the fundamental beliefs does not accurately reflect the teachings of Scripture with respect to the ministry of Christ on our behalf since his return to heaven. And so he recommended that the article be revised to reflect biblical teaching. That's the end of the story on Cottrell, and it's the end of our story, except for my conclusion. I have considered here the central, unique Adventist doctrine of the investigative judgment in terms of its origin and development, the views of Ellen White, Fundamental Belief 24, and its biblical support, and the current status of the debate. From my own independent reading of the cited biblical materials, especially those in Daniel and Hebrews, I conclude, with many others, Adventist and otherwise, that these texts do not support the doctrine as stated in Fundamental Belief 24. Daniel 7 does not refer to an investigative judgment. Daniel 8:14 does not refer to a cleansing of the sanctuary, a heavenly sanctuary, or an event to occur in AD 1844. Daniel 9 does not refer prophetically to Jesus, the Messiah. Hebrews does not support the notion that Jesus, the high priest, entered the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary on 22 October 1844 to begin an investigative judgment. Rather, it asserts that at the time of his ascension, Jesus applied the sacrificial results of his death in God's presence in heaven itself as atonement for repentant sinners. It may be presumptuous to use the final word here, but here endeth the gospel.
Well,
so I will stop this sharing and get back to, if I can get my mouse to
yes,
work here. There we go.
we're ready to begin our Q&A. Dr. Trenchard, once again, I speak for everyone when I express my gratitude for your straightforward clarity and not pulling any punches. It's I think you have condensed questions that we have all had into this relatively brief presentation in a way that seems very logical and easy to follow. And so for that, I thank you. So let's come to George. George, hi, George. Asking you to unmute so that you can begin. There you go. So George, you were quick on the trigger. What are you thinking this afternoon? Or questions that you have for Dr. Trenchard?
Yes, I have been, well, nice presentation. Thank you for this. I was waiting for this presentation with some, not anxiety, but expectation. You know that I've been acquainted with this issue for many, many years. But I learned some couple of new things in your presentation. I appreciate that. In the early 80s, I was studying Des Ford's Glacier View document in the format of a book, and it completely disturbed me at that time, I would say, because I had a college degree at our seminary in Brazil for 4 years studying theology. And then I noticed that my theology may be flawed. And so I decided to restudy my theology. And since the book of Hebrews has been the key. And at that time I remember that I thought about one teacher in college that told me, read and study the book of Hebrews, because that was not part of the curriculum. So we had to do it on our own, and I never did. But then when I learned all that stuff from Des Ford's book, everything, was clarified, and I learned what the Bible says. My question to you is only one. Why do you think that the Adventist church still refuses, and maybe will keep refusing to accept what the book of Hebrews so clearly teaches on this issue, which is 180 degrees opposite of what the church teaches, and based on Ellen White and all that? Why is it that this church cannot come honestly and clear and clean to resolve this problem. They're not gonna persuade God to change the book of Hebrews. They have to change their doctrines according to the book of Hebrews. Why do you think that this resistance still persists? And thank you for your presentation. Really appreciate it.
Well, George, I can't answer that question to your satisfaction, I'm sure. I don't know why. I mean, I can speculate like any of you as to why that may be the case. I can add to what you said by indicating that after the Glacier View event in 1980, there was considerable amount of disagreement at that time, but the disagreement that tended to favor Des's position was often suppressed and so forth. And so the church established another committee. You know, we love to establish committees. So they established the Daniel and Revelation Committee. The problem was they didn't establish the Daniel and Hebrews Committee. Now, the Daniel and Revelation Committee did have a number of meetings, one of which was in the early 80s in San Diego, California. I was working at the time in Canada at Canadian Union College, where my friend Jerry, who's online, I'm looking at your picture right now. Jerry is responsible for this. Don't blame me for this. Jerry wanted this, so this is what I did here today. But when I was in Canada, I was invited to attend and present at that that Daniel Revelation Committee in San Diego and deal with a question in the letter to the Hebrews, which I did. I was joined by several other New Testament students at the time who were asked to speak about other aspects of Hebrews. I was dealing with one particular assigned topic, and others dealt with things. And when the books came out, the series of documents were eventually published from the Daniel and Revelation Committee's work. There was not much on Hebrews, and nothing, virtually nothing from the day of presentation that several of us contributed to that San Diego meeting. It apparently was not part of the the previously understood position. There did not appear to be openness for understanding the text linguistically or contextually, because you're quite right. Hebrews has a very different perspective. I spent a lot of time dealing with Hebrews. I mentioned Hebrews basically only at the end of this presentation. But I've examined, for example, every use of, well, not only every use of the terms for sanctuary there, that was my assignment in San Diego, but every use of the term of high priest as it appears metaphorically to refer to Jesus, and establish a timeline for when all of these things relating to Jesus are said to happen by the author of Hebrews. Many of them have already happened by the time that he wrote. And those that were yet to come were primarily and almost singly related to his coming, which they thought would be soon. So all these elements, that we put off 18 centuries as to Jesus making a movement among the architectural elements of the sanctuary in heaven, none of that is anticipated in Hebrews. The only future thing that is left for Jesus to do is his final appearance and the application of all of this in the salvation of people through his second coming. That's the only thing left in the book of Hebrews as far as Jesus' role as high priest. So, yeah, many things could be done. It's inexplicable that the only place in the New Testament, in fact, the only place in the whole Bible where Jesus of Nazareth is related to any of this is in the letter to the Hebrews. and it's not even cited at the end of fundamental belief 24, at least not in that sense. So I don't know the answer to that. I think that it may lie in the fact that this has become the most central and characteristic teaching of Seventh-day Adventists over the decades, and therefore, and particularly the role of Ellen White in supporting it throughout her life, as I tried to demonstrate. She has a major section on this in the Great Controversy, published in 1988 and 1911. And there are those who say this is the most complete and full statement of the sanctuary doctrine and the investigative judgment that we have. So it's quite a task then. It's quite a responsibility, I suppose, then for anybody who is going to look at it and conclude in ways that have not been traditional for us.
Thank you, George. I appreciate your question. Lauren, I know you've unmuted yourself. What are you thinking? Many things, I imagine.
Well, yeah, this is probably, I've heard lots of pieces of this, Warren. I've never heard them all together like this, and probably this is the most comprehensive presentation I've heard. I think probably the most surprising thing to me is when you really follow on through Daniel what that sanctuary is. I mean, it's pretty astonishing that you begin to realize that couldn't be happening in heaven. George asked why it hasn't been accepted. I don't believe, by the way, Warren, I could be wrong, but I don't believe Seventh Adventist stands or falls on this. I think we've got enough other things that we can offer. But George asked, why doesn't the church recognize it? Why was there no consensus when they got this group together? Well, it's pretty simple. If it contradicts Ellen White, there will be no consensus. This is all about Ellen White versus the Bible, and Ellen White has to win. I mean, it's clearly very biblically weak, but that doesn't matter because Ellen White has to win. So that's how I see it. I think this keeps coming back to that same thing.
Yeah, Lauren, I also don't necessarily believe that Adventism rises or falls on this. That's been the assessment of it over time. And I also believe, that what you were saying about the role of Ellen White in this. She appears to have bought into elements of this before James did, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And just on a related, but in another area, I have a paper that I'm going to deliver to another group. I did it, I think it was around the 1st of February to a third one. But anyway, it is relating to the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary from 1953 to 57, which until recently has been the Adventist commentaries kind of people are trying to come out with a new 15-volume set at this point, but it's just in the early stages. In the Francis Nichol edited commentary 53 to 57, Francis Nichol laid down a principle that was enunciated by one of the associate editors in 1985. And the editor said, Elder Nichol indicated to us, speaking of the leadership team in the commentary, that no material in the commentary, the Adventist Bible commentary, 53 to 57, no material was to be included that could be perceived as contradictory to the writings of Ellen White.
Yep.
Now, that illegitimatized, in my judgment, the commentary as significant or serious or legitimate exegesis. Because anytime there is a theological overlay and constraint to what the interpreter is working with, then the Bible doesn't speak for itself, linguistically
right.
or contextually. And so I think you're right in that sense. That aura has been over us from the very beginning, and it continues to be there today.
And it's not going to go away. That is. By the way, while you're talking about Ellen White, I'm still reeling from that thing that you said that Satan is sitting in the holy place of the sanctuary, and anybody who prays at that time without accepting the message is praying to Satan. I mean, I just want to say, what on earth? I just, how do you possibly defend something like that? That is one of the craziest things I've ever heard.
Mm. Well, it wasn't the focal point of what I was doing today, but I thought
I
I'd
know.
mention it anyway when I was going through that
But
Daystar article.
it's such an astonishing statement. I mean, there's a few things in Ellen White that are simply indefensible. One is the stuff about amalgamation, but this is just indefensible. I don't know how you can say we all have to fall in line with that.
Well, in that experience in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1901, the declaration, she made the declaration to these Black Adventists
Yeah.
congregation that their whole focus was to prepare to go to heaven where there would be no color line. Now, color line certainly has to do with a racial thing. That's how it was understood at the turn of that century. And then to go on and say, where there be no color line, and all will be as white as Christ himself. The justification for this that I've received from people in high authority is that whiteness there is being used metaphorically for purity. No, not in the context of the expression dealing with color line. It means exactly what it says. Now, does that make Ellen White a racist? Not necessarily. I'm just simply saying this was a statement that clearly was made, and there's no real way of getting around it, I don't think.
It's astonishing. Thank you, Warren. You worked hard on this, and it's really comes through. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you. Paul, welcome. What are your thoughts this afternoon or wherever you may be, evening, morning, wherever?
Well, you brought up a whole lot of stuff that I found pretty confusing. But in my view, a simple reading of Daniel 8 indicates that the sanctuary was trampled underfoot by the little horn.
Mhm.
But if the sanctuary is being cleansed of the sins of the saints, that means that the saints are the little horn. So consequently, just based upon that principle, this doctrine of the investigative judgment is nonsense and needs to be thrown out. It bothers me that rather than changing our theology, that we disfellowship or pull the ministerial license of anybody who opposes that doctrine. That says something about the church that I don't like. I don't know. There's nothing that I can do about it. I just sit back and it goes on. But somehow, I feel that one of the reasons why we've been sitting around here for 135 years and that virtually nothing in the great controversy has been fulfilled is because the church is literally been in the wilderness for the past 135 years or more, and will probably continue to do so until we can begin to update some of our theologies. And the investigative judgment is just one of several that I have problems with. These are just my comments. I really don't have a question to ask.
Well, thank you, Paul. I would just add to that you can't understand. You say why a person who calls a question on this experiences the fate of, being shut down or shut out or whatever the case may be. That kind of reaction itself, I think, is an indirect indication that there is no answer that can be given to it by leadership. I mean, you can do this, that, and the other, you can fool around with it, but you still have these problems in place. So how do you deal with it? Well, you deal with it by the way that some politicians do. They get rid of the opposition, not address the issues that are raised. And if we're going to make any progress on this and anything else, we have to be open to and willing to engage in the evidence, and that has rarely ever happened.
Thank you. And thank you, Paul, for your observations. Appreciate that. Emmanuel, glad you're here today. What are your questions or observations for Dr. Trenchard?
I have so many of them. The first one, I am reading a book. Somebody approached me a couple of days ago, say, Emmanuel, read this book and give me an assessment of the book. Because I've been told this is the best book on the subject of the investigative judgment. The book is written in 2010 by somebody called Marvin Moore. The book is a total insult to scholarship. The book has 52 titles in the bibliography. Everything except 3 are Seventh-day Adventists. We are talking to ourselves. So when we talk about the investigative judgment, there is a strong cognitive dissonance on the table. There is a website in Australia called SDA Q&A. And in this website, they interview the late Dr. William Johnson. And they ask him, do you believe that something happened on October 22nd, 1844? I don't know how to answer this question. It was his answer. So my question for you, where are we going with the investigative judgment in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Regardless, is 1% of our doctrine or 90% of our doctrine? This is not biblical. Even Dr. Cottrell, they ask him, but you say this is not biblical, but why do you believe in it? Because Ellen White says so. Unbelievable.
Dr. Trenchard?
Maybe, Emmanuel, you could clarify for me what the question is. I listened with great interest in your observation. I'm acquainted
This is not biblical.
Right.
This is still in the book. Where are we going with this and for how long? I think there is a strong cognitive dissonance when we come to the table with the investigative judgment. Why we carry this load that destroys the gospel, that destroys the book of Hebrew?
Well, I think, several have addressed that here, and I think that remains to be that has been said. But I'm acquainted with Moore's book. I was asked to do a critical review of it for a journal, and I agreed to it, but they never sent it to me yet. So maybe that will happen one of these days. As I recall, it's primarily a book that surveys aspects of the New Testament, mainly on the sanctuary itself, and maybe to a lesser extent, the investigative judgment, but looks at all of the different, sacerdotal or priestly kind of language in the New Testament and so forth. So I was anxious to take a look at it in that sense, but haven't had the opportunity yet. But it is quite, if that is true, that most of the references are to Adventist scholars, that probably wouldn't, I wouldn't find that to be terribly encouraging in looking at this, because the text of Hebrews, for example, has been examined from many different perspectives by some incredibly well-known and highly competent people. Now, not everything does one necessarily agree with, but nobody has tried to explore the Hebrews in the way that we claim Hebrews should be examined, except in some of our own circles, and that's unfortunate, I think.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And Dr. Trenchard, Emmanuel mentioned Dr. William Johnson, who was the editor for
Right.
at least a couple of decades for the Review and Herald, but he ultimately disavowed belief in the investigative judgment. Did he not? Seems like I read that.
I can't cite that for sure. I knew Bill well. He was living in Southern California at the time he died. I redid his Wikipedia page for him. We had a lot of interactions and so forth. The thing that I think needs to be said about Bill Johnson, if nothing else, is that he devoted his graduate dissertation to the book of Hebrews. Bill was probably far and away, the most seriously educated in examining the arguments and materials in the book of Hebrews of any Adventist in our history. His doctorate from Vanderbilt was devoted to that, and he published the book. It's still in print today. So, yeah, Bill was particularly in his retirement. Bill felt it not only possible, but I think necessary to talk about a number of these kinds of things. And I can't cite, a particular statement with the finality that maybe you have suggested, but clearly Bill knew Hebrews very well. Mm-hmm. He knew the context, he knew the language, he knew the theology of Hebrews better than probably anybody else. And I know that he had concerns. Just how he would have stated them, I don't want to necessarily predict at this point.
Oh, not a problem. Eduardo, did you intend to lower your hand? I was just going to welcome you. Somehow you've lost your place in line, but if you want to raise your hand again, I'll acknowledge you. There you are. Let me come to you.
I think Eduardo just spoke, didn't he?
No, he didn't. It was Emmanuel.
Emmanuel, okay.
So Eduardo, you've unmuted. Please, welcome, and what are your thoughts today?
Thank you. I don't know what happened. I didn't unmute myself. Low my harm myself, but let me try. Warren, the first thing that I want to ask you is if you are familiar with this statement. I haven't read it before, but something happened. Just tell me if you are familiar with this statement.
Eduardo, are you going to read it?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, you've put it up on this. You put it up in the chat. Why don't you go ahead? Why don't you read it out loud?
I'll try. Still bearing humanity, he ascended to heaven, triumphant and victorious. He has taken the blood of his atonement into the holiest of all, sprinkled it upon the mercy seat on his own garments, and blessed the people. Are you familiar with this statement, Warren?
Who is it that made the statement?
Ellen G. White.
Okay, it sounds like something she would say. I probably have read that. I can't place exactly where it was and when, but that's typical, I think, of Ellen White understanding of the the architecture, that there is this sanctuary in heaven, that it has things like mercy seats and so forth. I don't actually
Okay,
I don't read Hebrews that way. To me, the language of Hebrews talks about Jesus entering the presence of God into what the text says is heaven itself. I don't think that, on
Warren,
777 Glory Avenue, there's a building, called the Heavenly Sanctuary, and that you can go in there and sit down on a throne in one part of it, and 18 centuries later move to another part. No, I don't find that to be part of the the understanding of all of this
okay,
through Hebrew.
okay, Warren, let me say something else. It sounds very clear for me that you are not aware of this statement. This is the ascension of Christ. After resurrection, this is talking about the ascension of Christ. He entered into the most holy place according to Hebrews. But in another letter, Sister White said that this was the inauguration of the sanctuary service. So people are not familiar.
Okay, well, I would appreciate if you would give us the reference to that. I'd be happy to look at that. If Ellen White actually said this, that would be a proper reading of Hebrews. But Ellen White also described the ascension of Jesus in Desire of Ages, in which she said, when Jesus went to heaven, he took with him all those people that were raised from the dead, according to Matthew 27. She has it confused as to when that event occurred. She decides, because it makes more sense to her, that it happened on the day of Jesus' resurrection. The text actually says it happened on the day of Jesus' death. When he died, the tombs were open and these people came out. It has nothing whatsoever to say in the text that these people went to heaven with him on the day of his ascension. So, I suppose we can play the notion of combative statements from Ellen White on this, but we can't be selective. If Ellen White actually said this about Hebrews, that Jesus went into the presence of God at the time when he ascended to heaven, I didn't hear that in what you read. But if that's what she said, then fine. That's what Hebrews said. I don't have any penchant against Ellen White's statements. But if the issue is that we are to base these positions on biblical materials, most of this, really, what I've read from her is not supported by biblical materials. So,
Warren, let me add something, because we do not have the privilege, the time you have. But let me say something else here. In regard to Ellen White authority, she said, you believe, let me put it on my own words, you believe in my writings, you believe in my prophetic office, because God gave you the evidence. God gave you the evidence to believe that I am a messenger of the Lord. So, I don't have the time to develop the sanctuary as you have the time, but I recommend you that the statement, the quote, the reference is on the statement. So you can check it for yourself. And I know that many, many people do not have seen this statement. And
okay,
lastly,
I don't typically try to wander off into the chat during these times, and if I get the chat afterwards, that's fine. But what I would like for you to do is simply tell me right now, where did this come from? Is this from first volume
He
of
cites-
Spiritual Gifts, or is it from Great
No,
Controversy?
he cites it, but I don't know what the abbreviation means.
It's the Youth Instructor. The Youth
what?
Instructor, July 25, 1901. Youth Instructor.
Harold,
25 July 19 what?
1901.
1901. Youth
I'm
instructor.
not sure. I'm not actually. I'm not sure, Eduardo, what it adds to the conversation that we haven't been talking about already. It seems like some of the things that we've already referenced. But yeah, it seems to agree with Hebrews to me.
25 July 1901 youth instructor.
Right.
Is there a
Correct.
page number that I could find it quickly in there?
Paragraph 4.
Paragraph 4?
That's what
page?
he's citing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I can probably find it. You know, I'll be happy to look at that. I'd have no problem I mean, Ellen White wrote an awful lot of stuff that wasn't in the Bible. But she also wrote more things that were in the Bible. So if she quoted the Bible accurately here, that's fine. I have no problem with that. I didn't hear that in what you read, but then I didn't see the text of it. So I can't say, but I will be happy to look at it.
I think, too, one of the things that makes it very confusing, at least for lay people like me, is to try and transpose Jesus onto the sanctuary service, is that Jesus was not from the tribe of Levi. He was from the tribe of Judah. And when he's
Right.
described as a high priest, he's described as on the order of Melchizedek, which has a grounding in things that are too, mysterious for us to know or understand. And so it would be different if Jesus had been from the tribe of Levi. It might be easier to understand in that regard. But
Jesus is much more typically presented as the son of David in New Testament materials, and that's that's what ties him to the tribe of Judah, of course. But
right.
Hebrews is alone in developing this notion of Jesus of Nazareth having the function of high priest in an ultimate kind of sense, metaphorical sense. I mean, Jesus is not a priest at all, and all of this is metaphorical, and we forget this so often. That and what he does as high priest is clearly kind of laid out chronologically if you look at it carefully in Hebrews, but nowhere else is that developed. The writer clearly struggles with the notion that Jesus is from Judah and not from Levi, and he plays this interesting thing with a person who is not a Hebrew priest at all, somebody who is a priest outside of all of this at the time of Abraham. It's a very interesting kind of rationalization, let's say. I mean, that's what we would be accused of if we were doing that today. But the writer of Hebrews is very, very savvy and knows that he can't get anywhere with a Levitical priesthood for Jesus. Everybody knows that. So he finds this thing, and he plays on the notion of that this character in Genesis is without father and mother. Well, nobody's without father and mother. And all that means ultimately in the text is that we don't know who his parents were, not that he didn't have them. So there's a lot of very interesting kind of stuff that goes on, there. But it's unique. And if you're going to develop a doctrine of Jesus as high priest and essentially ignore Hebrews or try to reinterpret it in some non-contextual ways, you're not going to get very far.
Yes, and thank you for that. And Carmen Seibold has cited the reference. Lauren, I'm fully convinced that all the years of your marriage, you must have locked Carmen in a room and chained her to a desk and made her memorize everything. That woman can pick up Ellen White quotes. Well, I mean, it's too bad.
I have to agree. She is an astonishing researcher, and I depend on her a lot. She'll come up with just great stuff. Not just Ellen White, but I mean lots of different things in history. Yes, she's a great researcher.
Yeah, I have asked her myself, and bam, it pops up in the chat. I got to say, thank you, Carmen. Unacknowledged, but much appreciated. So, Stephen Terry, you're from the Northwest of the United States. Welcome. What is your thought or question today?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say to Dr. Trenchard that I was looking forward to his presentation today. A few years ago, I published a commentary on the book of Daniel, and I wanted to see how his thoughts aligned with some of what I published. The investigative judgment, I don't have a problem with the idea that there is some sort of an investigative judgment biblically, because Revelation 22:12 tells us, look, I'm coming soon, my reward is with me, and I will give to each person according to what they have done. How could he give the reward if some sort of investigation of who deserves that reward had not been done? But that does not mean that I align with the Seventh-day Adventist position on the investigative judgment. There's some interesting factors, some of which may have been touched upon already, because I was having some connection issues apparently, and I missed some of the discussion. But Hiram Edson's vision of the heavenly sanctuary was a day after the Great Disappointment. And yet, approximately 2 months later, in December of 1844, Ellen White was prophesying that probation had closed.
Mhm.
In the Present Truth in August 1849, she also mentioned that, and also in the disputed vision in Camden, New York, in June of 1851. Joseph Bates had held that the Perusia would be 7 years after 1844 on October 22nd of 1851. This is why I believe Ellen continued to say probation was closed for the lost until that date. While some dispute the authenticity of the Camden vision, what was published in Present Truth in 1849 was still long after the date of Hiram Edson's vision. When the date came and went 7 years after the fact, they re-examined Edson's idea and came up with the investigative judgment doctrine. This acceptance of Edson's vision after so many years may seem to some like a facile attempt to rationalize what had happened without abandoning the earlier interpretation of 1844. However, to those believers, it provided an explanation they could run with and a defense against those who were accusing them of folly in setting a date for the second coming, a practice which the Bible says is futile in Matthew 24:36. Such an interpretation allowed them to deny they were in error and to escape the charge of date setting for the Perusia. After all, it turned out it was not really the second coming they were predicting. It was the start of the judgment. Why they chose to double down on 1844 instead of recognizing the error is open to speculation. It may have to do with Ellen White's claim of the prophetic gift. They were trapped by Deuteronomy 18, verse 22, which reads, "If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed."
Stephen,
Since-
excuse me. Stephen, pardon me just a minute. You appear to be reading from something.
I'm reading from my commentary that I wrote.
I see. We try to keep things a little bit on the brief side here.
Well,
and
if you don't
it's-
have time for this, I can leave. It's no problem.
Well, I wonder if there's somewhere where you would like Dr. Trenchard to respond.
Yes, when I'm done sharing this. It's only 2 paragraphs,
Okay. Okay.
and you've given more time to other people than what I've taken so far. I don't understand.
Well, I
What the-
apologize. I felt in the dark because I was not clear on where it was clear you were reading, but not from what. So I apologize. Please complete your reading.
At any rate, since Ellen White claimed to be a prophetess and was well known to proclaim and endorse the significance of 1844. What's that? Anyway, renouncing that date as an error would also invalidate her claim to be a prophetess sent by God. The choice made by the founders to double down on 1844 in the decades that followed made the difference between a denomination that would shrivel and die under the withering criticism of those who had not accepted 1844, or who did and subsequently abandoned it when nothing happened, and a denomination that grew to be a global enterprise with 23 million members in many schools, universities, hospitals, churches, and disaster relief centers. One might think, upon examining the fundamental statement of beliefs voted in Dallas in 1980, that little of our theology depends on this doctrine of the investigative judgment. Without it, the denomination name stays intact for the fact that the Parousia is well-established Christian doctrine, and the Seventh-day Sabbath is also well-founded both biblically and in ante-Nicene Christianity. However, some have viewed the investigative judgment as a cross to die upon, even going as far as to defrock ministers who dared to question it. Yet this is the same church that several decades ago would also fire pastors who baptized individuals who chose to wear wedding rings, a practice that today is rarely, if ever, questioned, many ministers as well as lay members having taken up wearing them. If this doctrine on wedding rings, which was considered so vital only a short time ago, could be revisited, why not the idea of an investigative judgment that began in 1844, a year that by any other account was unremarkable, save for the failure of Jesus to appear? If it is because it calls into question the prophetic gift of Ellen White, that may only be a problem if we ignore her own statements that she was not without error. And Dr. Trenchard, I appreciate what you've shared today because I feel in some aspects it aligns with what I've shared from my commentary. And I feel that the Adventist Church has somewhat painted itself into a corner here with this doctrine of the investigative judgment. Because in order to abandon that doctrine, we have to abandon the statements that Ellen White has made in support of it. Some statements which she claimed were in vision, direct from God. And
So
I don't see a church.
Terry, let me ask you something. I'm doing this in place of Dr. Trenchard, but it sounds like what you're saying is basically that it was a practical decision that served to enhance the church's power. And I'm fine with that. I just don't know why it has to continue the church's authority and longevity. I'm just not sure why it has to continue, why it's still, we can see through it now, in other words.
Well, perhaps it's a little bit like an oil tanker out on the ocean. It takes a long time to stop one of those or to change direction. And we have 23 million members, which represents a lot of that oil that we're carrying as cargo.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Dr. Trenchard, did you wish to weigh in at all? Dr. Trenchard, you're muted. I'm so sorry.
Very good.
Stephen, this is the kind of thing that you and I could probably sit down and have an interesting conversation. It's very difficult to respond, to so much in a short time in this context. I don't think this has kind of gone into the area of why has the church done this? How can we get out of it in a different direction and so forth? That really goes beyond my presentation. All of you, are the ones that have to decide where this goes from here. In my role, I may have to decide that as well, but not. I should say, in my role as a Seventh-day Adventist church member, I may have to decide that. I'm not sure that that's my role as a Seventh-day Adventist investigator. I've tried to lay out something, and it may or may not be justifiable. If I have any area of expertise, it would be in dealing with New Testament stuff. My education is in New Testament and early Christian literature. So what I'm doing with Daniel and Leviticus and so forth is secondary to that. But I think there is a commonality in that I'm dealing with context, language. I can read the Hebrew text and I can look up the words and I can look at context and I can see how things are developed throughout, a whole corpus like the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint Greek and the Old Testament. But some of these questions, the last word on some of these questions regarding, let's say, what Hebrews means or Leviticus has to be examined, I think, by people whose expertise is in that area. So I'm not going to go to the stake, as it were, in defense of some of those points of view. I think my reading of Hebrews doesn't differ significantly. Well, of Daniel, let's say, doesn't significantly differ from Ray Cottrell's, and I'm content with that. Ray said we have a problem with this. I think he was right. Ray said that the biblical text doesn't support our positions on this. I think Ray was right. And where we go from here as a church, as a faith community, and so forth, doesn't depend on me. I would have ideas about that. Ray probably did too. But at the end of the day, it all has to do with you, all of you, and all the people like you everywhere. And the everywhere is expanding. We're talking about 23 million people. And the overwhelming majority of those people are very, very traditional. They're not looking at this in the kind of contextual and linguistic ways. They haven't been introduced to Adventism that way. I will tell you, I have a very pessimistic understanding of the future of Adventism in terms of progressive thinking. Because progressive or open thinking, open to evidence, is not a characteristic of the world church today. It is such, the situation is such that any reasonable person looking at a general conference session on a matter of doctrinal issues and so forth, or practices that arise out of biblical materials, you can predict exactly how each of these is coming out within a percentage or two based on the demographics of the world church today. And it is not improving from the perspective of those who look for evidence and openness. It is not improving.
That's right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I wish it were different. Let's put it that way. But we each have our own integrity we have to live with and so forth. And that's,
Thank you for your response, Dr. Trenchard.
Yes, indeed. And Dr. Trenchard, I think I accidentally muted you. I'm sorry. My screen flipped around. My apologies. We did hear everything you said, though. Thank you for that. Mildred, welcome. Please share your thoughts.
Yes. I'm not an expert on church history, SDA church history, but I believe that it's very important to use our time to establish our biblical basis for example, the Daniel 8. I have been studying Daniel 8 for several years and written my master thesis on Daniel 8 it's found at Andrews University Commons or something like that. And it's called Can Covenant Theology Be Found in Daniel 8? So this is a biblical study. When it comes to the 2300 morning period, I have a reason why I still think the period could point beyond Antiochus Epiphanes' destruction of the temple. And the reason for me at the moment is that when we compare the three visions of Daniel as the parallel visions, and I'm thinking of Daniel 2, the vision there, and the vision in Daniel 7, and the vision in Daniel 8 as well. So I'm sure that you have been reading about this before. So in Daniel 2, we have the Babylon as the first. And in Daniel 7, it's the lion. In Daniel 8, it's nothing there. But at the second level, it's in Daniel 2, Medio-Persia. In Daniel 7, it's the bear, and in Daniel 8, it's Media-Persia. The third level, it is in Daniel 2, it's Greece. In Daniel 7, it's the leopard, and in Daniel 8, it's Greece as well, Javan, and with the 4 horns. And then in Daniel 2, as the fourth kingdom, it's Rome. And in Daniel 7, it's the terrible beast with the 10 horns. And then in Daniel 8, it's still this 4 horns and the little horn. Then we come to Daniel 7, which talks about, in the end, this little horn. And then also in Daniel 8, which speaks about this little horn. Then I wondered, my question is there any reason why the little horn in Daniel 8 should not be compared to Daniel 7? Because due to this comparison, I'm still open to that a period of 2,300 evening morning and period of 300 evening mornings can reach beyond Antiochus Epiphanes. So I just want to share my thoughts like that.
Well, my first reaction to that would, if you read Daniel 8 that way, Daniel 8:14 that way, does your 2,300, whatever they are, extend for 20 centuries or more? Does it extend to AD 1844, in other words?
Mildred, I'm trying to unmute you so you can respond if you'd like to.
I'm calling it 2,300 evening morning period.
Okay, you said that may extend beyond Antiochus Epiphanes, okay, but does it extend to AD 1844?
I'm just calling it 2,300 evening morning period.
Okay, well, I think that's pretty, the answer to that question is pretty significant in terms of, Daniel. I mean, if one, as I do, take, for example, the book of Revelation, which, doesn't get the same kind of attention, except for like the 1,260, whatever they are, days or something, times dividing of time and so forth. We tend to talk about Revelation as extending through historicist reading for a very long time after the writer and the original readers. But the time frame in Revelation is consistently described by a whole series of adverbs that put the message and what's going to happen in the time period of the readers. Soon, the idea, right at the beginning of Revelation, there is a construction, literary construction that turns up near the end of Revelation that specifically says this is material to happen very soon. Now, to rationalize that for 18 centuries into the future, I think does terrible disservice to the book of Revelation. But that's what we do. And we're trying to do the same thing with, even before Revelation, we did it with Daniel 8:14, as the Millerites did. Sucking in the year-day principle, day, year, day, whichever we choose to follow, into that with no justification whatsoever. And then, the complete misreading of Daniel 9 on the word Mashiach, which I tried to present here, that even the even the King James Bible is consistent except for that chapter in 2 places, translating that word as simply an anointed or the anointed one. Mm-hmm. And to rationalize that this is the Messiah, the Prince, or whatever, which gives notion that gives a suggestion that this is dealing with Jesus of Nazareth, has no contextual basis and no linguistic basis. So, I mean, I don't have a problem. I don't know when Daniel's anticipate, the visions in Daniel and the prophet's anticipation of what he was dealing with. I don't know when that would potentially be applied. I mean, I'm not prepared to go with Des Ford's apodolismatic principle of interpreting text, and you got this sort of close and long interpretations. I don't see the text supporting that either. I just don't know when these things take place. I do work from the principle that the writers expected that they knew what they were writing, and that they expected that their readers also would know what they're writing. So something that goes off millennia into the future, their writers would have no likelihood of having any concept of what this would mean. And so the notion that all of this is written back in the 5th century BC or the 2nd century or the 1st century AD, all of this is written for us here in the 21st century is preposterous. There's no basis for really developing that. I mean, if one takes the Bible seriously, you have to take the writers seriously, and you have to take the readers seriously. And the text must mean something to the writer of Hebrews and the writer's expected readers in Hebrews. It has to mean something to those people, or there's no reason for them to be receiving messages from God to speak to people at a particular time. So, there's a lot of problems there. I don't know all the answers with regard to replacing what is clearly problematic. I don't know how to replace that. And that may be up to all of us to put our heads together and get into the biblical text and say, well, what kind of sense can we make out of these things for us today? All I know as someone who reads these ancient texts, that's not what it meant to them.
Well, and Dr. Trenchard, your remark is further affirmed by the fact that Daniel's book is written in 2 different languages, and the portion of it written in Hebrew was certainly, wouldn't you agree, more likely directed toward Jewish readers than the rest of us.
Right, except that these same Jewish readers no longer knew how to read Hebrew after a while, and so the Aramaic was
Well,
their
there's
only,
a problem.
was
There's
the
a
only
problem.
access to it. Yeah, but I understand.
Mildred, thank you for your comment. And Lauren, I'm wondering if at this time, if you want to speak a word. You'll have to unmute to do it, though.
I'll bet I will. Yes, just a reminder that next week, I've tried really hard, all of you, to not get stale here, to keep new people coming in, to give young people a chance. And Marcel Rice is one of those. He is a young man, and he's a really smart and interesting pastor. He's working up in Europe right now, and I'm trying to remember. I think he's in Scandinavia, but I'm not exactly sure. So I invited him to come, and we also like to rotate through different topics. And so next week is going to be biblical theology. We're going to hit hard on what did Jesus really mean when he sat down with his disciples and said, do this in remembrance of me, and instituted the communion service. So I'm really looking forward to this. Come on, join us next week. Let's give this young man a strong showing that we appreciate his work as a young pastor over in Europe, and that's going to be next week. So that's all I've got to say.
And Dr. Trenchard, I want to assure you that in no way does Lauren mean to imply that your remarks are stale or redundant.
Yes, I'm not suggesting that you're over the hill, Warren.
Actually,
So, Ed,
I live in the hills, but
yes.
But over the hill, yeah, I am over the hill. That's true. But
I think actually most of my people who are my age and older would say, yeah, let's hear from more young people.
Well, yes, what we can all affirm is that for many of us here, Dr. Trenchard and myself included, it is no longer possible to die young. So, with absolute certainty. So, Ed, welcome to you. I don't know if you're really sitting where your background suggests, but it's really idyllic. But welcome to you. What are you thinking
Dr. Trenchard, I really appreciate you having to, or presenting, for example, that investigative judgment. That expression is really not in the Bible. So I appreciate that. A number of years ago, I thought it was a good thing if I taught the 28 fundamental beliefs. And so I did that with some people. And as I got through them, I started to question the validity of some of their logic, and particularly the one that you've presented today. And I noticed that certain Adventist churches still continue to do that. And part of the problem I had with today's topic is just the timeline in terms of the change of the calendar, Georgia, Grigor and Georgia and all this. And the Jewish calendar was 360 days. And anyways, it just didn't seem to add up, properly. So I think this particular belief diminishes the character of God. That Jesus, after 1800 years, steps into another section of heaven. Doesn't make sense to me. And they have to pore over these books. When on the cross, Jesus was able to save the thief next to him and say, "You're going to be in heaven." But now, is that person or other people that Jesus saved, are they going to have to be looked at in the investigative judgment? So I have two questions. One is, has this created fear amongst? What's your opinion about whether this has created fear amongst Adventists? The second question is, what about other denominations when they realize what we're teaching with this belief? What do they think about it?
Well, it was not part of my assignment to deal with this, but I would say that there seems to have been a massive amount of fear generated among those who are confronted with and try to maintain belief. Particularly, I think younger people have testified. They grew up with this, and it was a very negative kind of environment in that sense. So I can only reflect what I've seen and heard.
Mhm.
What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
What about other denominations?
Oh,
Christian denominations?
Well, as Ray Cottrell wrote, there's been more criticism of Adventism from within and outside of Adventism on this doctrine than all other elements of Adventism combined. Now, I can't vouch for the veracity of his statistics, as it were, but this was his understanding. So, as I've looked at questions on doctrine, for example, there's really quite a large amount of material on this that represents serious questions that were being brought to Adventists back in the 1950s and 60s over, the dialogue as to whether Adventists were part of, really Christians or were some kind of sectarian deviants. And, I think Adventists probably had the hardest time trying to convince those who were their critics at that time. At least as I've read the material, they had a very difficult time, and I don't think ever ultimately satisfied them that on this area of Adventist doctrine that Adventists were biblically based. So, no, this is not something that typically Christians of other faith communities have part of their theological understanding. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have some form of pre-Advent judgment, some form in which God has a way of determining, people that participate in a future celestial environment or whatever. But they don't express it in these kind of ways, and they don't talk about things happening in a particular time in the middle of the 19th century, depicted and anticipated by somebody prior to the time of Jesus. That is not part of any other Christian community that I know of.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Appreciate that. Well, Jerry, I guess you're the one that started all this, so you've waited till the end, or near the end at least, to weigh in. What do you have to say?
Yeah, I'll first say, Linda, guilty as charged. Yeah, I thought it would be something that the group would be very, very interested in, and it seems like it is. Just a little bit of information, and to add to what Dr. Trenchard might have said, and just responding to a few other comments that people made both in the chat and in discussion. Ed Reifsnyder said from his estimate, rather than 23 million, from his guess, there's less than half of that actually go to church. Ty Gibson, maybe a year ago, he loves to do deep dives in the archives. He came up with 6 million. Dr. Trim, who is the archivist, about a year ago said 8 million. That's what I came up with, some fairly deep dive in the archives as far as attendance in the, out of the 23 million. Just somebody else mentioned about the quote with Bill Johnson. And I listened to the, about the investigative judgment, I listened to the interview of Bill Johnson just about a year before he died. And the discussion was, back from the 50s and defending Adventism back then on the TV shows. And then up until, what he believed at, a year before he died. And the investigative judgment topic came up. And as Dr. Trenchard said, he's maybe one of the best scholars on the book of Hebrews. And when asked point blank, what he believed about the investigative judgment, and here's the direct quote, it's a tragic doctrine. Now, if you want to know why he might have thought that, you just need to read. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. Great Controversy, page 492, I believe it is in the black copy, 482. And I have said on here a few times, when I was preaching at the college church at Union College, and one of my church members came up who has a PhD in nursing and specializes in death and dying and hospice. And she said to me, Jerry, of all the Christians that I've walked the final, walk of life with, Adventists have the most fear of death. And if you want to know why, just read Great Controversy, page 482. And you can't get away from that. You can't read that without coming away completely depressed. And it's so opposite in juxtaposition to New Testament soteriology and confidence in your eternal destiny. So that would just another piece out there. At Bill Shea's funeral, and again, this is new information for most of you, Lauren and I have talked about it, and Dr. Trenchard and I have talked about it, and I've shared this with a few other people, but at Bill Shea's funeral, which he lived just 15 miles from us, went to the Manassas Church in Virginia, which, if you don't know this area, the Battle of Bull Run, the Civil War started there, I guess, and Battle of Bull Run, that's Manassas, Virginia. And he was one of my professors at the seminary, and I'm glad to go to his funeral. I know his wife, Karen, she's still alive. Dick Davison was one of the people who came to, just part of the memorial service. But what was really interesting is that at Bill Shea's funeral service, Dick Davison brought up the issue of the investigative judgment. And he said, I struggled for many, many years to answer the questions of my students and others, questions they had about the investigative judgment. And then he said, he read a paper written by Bill Shea on Daniel 9, which, gave him some perspective. He didn't get into the details because it wasn't appropriate at a funeral service, a memorial service. But I thought it was interesting that those of you who know Dick Davison, who's Old Testament professor at the seminary, was my Old Testament professor at the seminary in the 80s, would confess that. I thought that was really interesting. Another thing, and I have to leave the person anonymous, but you'll just have to take this on faith that I'm telling the truth. One of our most visible scholars in Adventism said to me, I don't know, a year ago maybe, whose network in the scholarly world of Adventism is very broad and global, said that his colleagues, they just hope the whole doctrine of the investigative judgment dies a natural death over the next couple of generations. And and Warren, just about the interpretation, everything being in the hearing of the readers of the book of Revelation when it was written and as it was passed around in that generation. I think one of the people who may have made Adventism, stretch it out so much. One of the classes I took in seminary he was known as the king of chiastic structures. Bob Johnson knows exactly who I'm talking about, Dr. Kenneth Strand. And he found all kinds of chiastic structures, that stretch things out. Just a little sidebar on that. He was just a really good Christian man. All of us as his students struggled to make sense of what he was saying. So Bill Shea used to sit in on the classes and take notes and then give us copies of his notes, the King of Chiastic Structures lectures. And I want to just close with, from what I'm saying with this comment, other than thanking Dr. Trenchard for taking up my, challenge. As a pastor, a retired pastor, and as a clinical psychotherapist, and I think all of us as pastors dealing with people, when you get to listen to the fear in the hearts of some people and the spiritual devastation that Great Controversy, page 482, does to people spiritually, the moral implications of that for us as a denomination is terrible.
Yeah. Any thought, Dr. Trenchard?
No, I welcome Jerry's rumination on this, and it it reflects positively, I think, on times when we were together in the classroom many years ago in the Great White North. So thank you, Jerry. I just hope that the examination of this from a biblical and kind of historical perspective within as an approach has at least met your objective. I'm not asking you whether you agree with all of that, but is this the kind of stuff that you had in mind? I did test it out on you a little bit, on Lauren and so forth. And so there are various ways of looking at this. Pastorally, of course, is certainly one. But in terms of historical development and linguistic and contextual characteristics of the biblical text is another. These are other ways of looking at that, and that's what I have at least a modicum of competence in, and what I chose to do.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yvonne, welcome. We're getting low on time, but I want to hear what your question or thought is.
Yeah, well, thank you, Doctor, very much for your presentation. Just wanted to make a comment. I had the opportunity of leading out in a small group on the book of Hebrews, so I was reading through non-Adventist commentaries, and I came across one of the commentaries with the series New American Commentary, written by David L. Allen in 2010. And so I was coming to the within the veil text in chapter 6, verse 19, and the author was going into several Seventh-day Adventist Andrews University Seminary studies. He referred to Richard Davidson, N. Young, G. Rice, and Roy Gain, and all this stuff. And then the author was made the comment, said, you know, it's rather interesting that within the same publication, you'd have Young responding to Davidson's article, vice versa. Anyway, I just thought it was rather interesting that some people read some of this stuff and they even incorporate some of this stuff in their commentaries. And I don't know if any of you have the New American Commentary, but just for the fun of it, look it up. It's rather interesting. That's all.
Thank you. Any comment about that, Dr. Trenchard?
Well, it is interesting that that one can certainly find most anything if you look enough. I found it interesting in tracing some, not necessarily these particular issues, but similar issues where people are content to go back into the 17th century and find some commentator that might have agreed with them. And you know, there clearly in the world of scholarship, there are people who will present a whole wide range of ideas. There are several websites. I don't necessarily find them entirely persuasive, but there are websites about what are the best commentaries on particular books of the Bible. And I can assure you that this particular one that Yvonne has mentioned is not going to be listed very high in that grouping. I mean, I could list off for you the ones that typically would reach the top of that, and everybody would look at that and agree or disagree with it in one way or another, I'm saying. But so, you know, that somebody might be persuaded to follow a particular article that would understand the curtain in Hebrews to be different from most people. You can certainly find that, and people continue to present these. I mean, I have just written a substantive piece and have presented on it in a couple of places on Ellen White's the use of the Adventist Bible Commentary, 1953 to 57, of Ellen White's material that comes from outside the Bible. And it's incorporated into the Adventist Bible Commentary in 53 to 57 as though that's the meaning of the biblical text. Well, that doesn't make it the meaning of the biblical text. The biblical text is the biblical text. And the fact that Ellen may have created a whole episode dealing with the ascension of Jesus, where all the dead saints in Matthew 27 go to heaven with him as first fruits, that doesn't mean that it's what Matthew had in mind in including that in Matthew 27. So, you know, another thing is what I call the great comma controversy. The great comma controversy is how do you punctuate Luke 23:43? Where does somebody mentioned about the the Jesus and the penitent thief, what he said to the penitent thief. What we didn't hear today is that Adventists are among the few people in the whole world who put the comma where they do in relationship to the word today, the Greek word sameron. And this goes back to 1853 in Seventh-day Adventist writing. And it was no more acceptable then than it is today. Ellen doesn't deal with this. She just puts the comma where Adventist people were telling her to put the comma, consistently doing so throughout all of her writings. But that doesn't make it so. In the words of Sammy Davis Jr., it ain't necessarily so, you know? And
No, that was George Gershwin.
right. But Sammy Davis, I think, sang it at one point. Yeah, it was Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, exactly. But so, you know, we can find people who will take certain positions on things, no matter how outlandish these may be. You'll find somebody who goes with it. But in most cases, the tendency of scholarship is not in those kinds of directions. And the fact that, you know, you don't like what Jesus said to the thief on the cross, and you punctuate, even the King James Bible was considered to be wrong by early Adventists in this. And so they put the comma in a certain place. We got no problems with this text, they said in the Adventist Review. All we have to do is move the comma to a different place. On what basis? Nobody chose to look at the 78 or 9 uses of the formula, today I say unto you, or simply, truly I say unto you, that formula is found numerous times in the 4 Gospels. And oftentimes there are adverbs like today or tonight or tomorrow or whatever found in these things. And never do these adverbs ever go with the formula. So, but nobody looks at this. Nobody looks at this in Adventist studies. The latest piece in 2013 in Ministry Magazine is still spouting the same stuff that was put out in 1853, with no reference to what is going on in the biblical text. Now, you could probably find people that might agree with that, but it doesn't make it so.
Well, we can tell you feel strongly about that. I feel strongly about grammatical things as well. But in any case, Ed, you fell off your spot to be next, but I see you've come back, and so I've unmuted you. I thought I was going to have to ask your question for you because I know what it is, but you can go ahead since you're here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm glad we got the musical attributions correct. Second, Linda, thank you for posting that text for John 5:24 in the chat, because that's what I want to talk about. I'm sure I had read John 5:24 many times before, but 2 or 3 years ago, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Because Jesus says, if you hear me and if you believe in the one who sent me, you do not come into judgment. What? You do not come into judgment, but you have passed tense, from death to life. And these are the words of Jesus.
Yep.
Now, the original King James Version, shall we say the ancient King James Version, didn't say judgment. It said does not come into condemnation. I've done a pretty thorough review of most modern versions, which most of them say judgment. And as squishy, if I can use that term, as squishy as the investigative judgment construction project is, based on multiple assumptions that have to all trip the right way to work this out, here is a statement that's not squishy at all. It's pretty concrete. And it comes from the mouth of our Savior. I've never heard a sermon on John 5:24, and I doubt that I ever will in my church. So how do we explain away John 5:24 in preference of a squishy doctrine?
Dr. Trenchard?
I'm done ranting now.
It's okay. And I have to make a correction. It really wasn't George Gershwin. It was Ira Gershwin who wrote the lyrics. But anyway, so Dr. Trenchard, what do you think about what Ed asked you?
Well, obviously, that is the counterpoint. Again, speaking of music, I guess the counterpoint to this, and I am not, Ed, I would say that just a little differently. I certainly am aware of, and I support the. I'm aware of that declaration and support its importance. Absolutely. I may be a little less confident that it comes from the words of mouth of Jesus. He's quoted there in the fourth gospel that way. So the only thing I can verify is that it is part of the text of the Gospel of John. That I would say with certainty. What that means with regard to the historical Jesus is potentially something else. But because the view of Jesus of Nazareth in the fourth gospel is very, very different from that of the synoptic gospels. And all of them differ from Q, which is the earliest sort of level we can find our way back to as far as Jesus is concerned. But yes.
But of course, we could say the same thing about Daniel 8:14. All we can say is it's there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I don't want to minimize the importance of that text. It is extremely important in this whole thing. And it's not the only one, but it's the most declarative and less squishy, as you put it, of what we have available. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Hey,
Thank you.
Before
Yes,
we
and
go
thank you.
on, Warren, are you okay staying? We're already after 4. Are you okay staying on for the last 2 questions?
Yeah, at this stage of my antiquity, I
Okay.
don't have a lot of competing things. So, you probably want to close it mercifully for yourself at some point soon.
No, I'm fine, but I like that. I'm going to use that at this stage of my antiquity. I like that. Good. I just wanted to be courteous to you and make sure that you
Thank
were
you. Thank you.
All right, then. So, Cliff, we come to you.
Okay, again, I'd like to give my usual caveat. I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the general conference. And they probably wouldn't be thrilled I'm on here, and I'd appreciate if not saying anything to anyone there. Anyway, all that aside, I've written 2 books on the pre-Advent judgment, the investigative judgment, and I have a sermon I recently just wrote called The Pre-Advent Judgment. I preached it in Australia a while back. I preached it at my home church and whatever. All that aside, I'd like to just go back to those quotes of Ellen White that was brought up earlier. The only thing, every time people bring that up, they neglect to mention that all she was doing is fleshing out half a dozen Bible texts on judgment. For God shall bring every work into judgment, every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Jesus said, you shall give an account of every idle word and so on. So it always frustrates me, especially too, if you read on in the rest of Great Controversy, she talks about when the names come up, Jesus doesn't excuse their sins and he knows their defects. And if you ever read volume 5 of the testimonies, Joshua and the angel, it's powerful. She talks about the fallenness of God's people and yet their faith, so Jesus' merits cover them. And see, it's very easy to selectively pick a few Ellen White things here and there, which of course we do with the Bible.
But all that aside, and I'll end on this point, we as Adventists, we are not alone to struggle with the biblical doctrine, the biblical teachings of justification by faith alone and judgment by works. I've read evangelicals, I've read Roman Catholics, I've read other denominations struggle with it. And I would humbly suggest that I believe that we as Adventists, we have the answer. The answer is the sanctuary doctrine. And I believe the key text is Daniel 8:14. When the sanctuary, as soon as you bring in the sanctuary, you bring in the gospel. That's the whole plan of salvation was taught in the gospel. And when the sanctuary's cleansed, it's Day of Atonement. It's Yom Kippur. Atonement is about blood, blood, blood. I sometimes say facetiously, Adventists are the only people in the world that could take a doctrine dedicated to atonement, to what Jesus does for us with his blood, and turn it into a bummer. I mean, everything I preach, the pre-Advent judgment, is the gospel message for end time people. It explains how we get through the undeniable biblical teaching of a judgment and of a judgment by works. Anyway, for whatever, that's my little spiel. So. Thank you.
Dr. Trenchard, any thought?
Well, I wasn't talking today or asked to speak about pre-Advent judgment. I think that has to be examined on its own merits. I was asked to talk about the investigative judgment in the context of the Adventist doctrine of the sanctuary. And Clifford, despite your eloquence in talking about this, you still have not addressed the issue of the mistranslation of the King James Bible in Daniel 8:14. You have not addressed the issue of the Adventist irrevocable location of this event in the first half of the 19th century. And I might say that the four quotes that I took from Ellen White, I got from Bob Olson in his article published by the White Estate on Ellen White and the investigative judgment. So yes, I made a selection, but I made a selection that was very, very in-house. And one of those quotes talked about how Ellen and her group back in the mid-1840s were struggling over the issues, particularly the passing of the time. This was the language. In other words, the so-called disappointment. They were trying to figure out what on earth was going on and how they could survive this. And so this was a unique expression that Ellen White made in that 1906 letter, where she said there was confusion. We had all kinds of ideas going around. Ministers and doctors, I think probably no doctors, but anyway, ministers and doctors at that time were coming up with all kinds of stuff. We didn't know truth from error. But I, she says, was taken off in vision. I would be taken off in vision. That is to say, as a matter of practice, this would happen. And she would receive the information that would sort out truth from error. Now, this is probably the most powerful sentence I've ever read in Ellen White that had to do with her impact on Adventist doctrine. And so, yes, we can talk about pre-Advent judgment. We can see all kinds of stuff around the Bible that talks about, judgment for things that you've done, the good and the evil and so forth. And we have to put that into some kind of context. But into an Adventist doctrine that says on the 22nd of October, 1844, there's something that materially changes in the divine plan of salvation. And there's architecture of stuff in heaven that suddenly comes into play. That is what there is no biblical support for.
Thank you. Well, and as I come to Dr. Johnston, I'll probably get myself in trouble here, but I think all of this would be a lot easier if we could mentally divorce ourselves from the penal substitution theory of atonement. So anyway, Bob, let me come to you. You got the last.
My question has been anticipated quite substantially. As I read denominational literature now, I do not encounter the term investigative judgment very much. It's used mostly by its critics. Instead, I see a lot about the pre-Advent judgment, which seems to be a replacement. Is this impression correct? And if it is, how does it affect the discussion? That's my simple question.
Well, Bob, I think it's not correct, because in 2005, when we had the latest update of the fundamental beliefs, moved from 27 to 28, fundamental 23, which we've been talking about today, became fundamental 24. Almost 50%, as I noted in my presentation of that, almost 50% of that statement of the language of fundamental 24 is devoted to the investigative judgment, and the language itself, not pre-Advent judgment, the language itself is used in that statement. And that dates from 2005. I think that's the last official revision of fundamental beliefs that we've had as a church, and I think that's unavoidable.
I was thinking of other literature besides the creedal statement.
Well, there's
journal
nothing,
articles and so
I
forth.
think there would be nothing, the baptismal vows are based on that. In fact, there's even an alternative baptismal vow, as you well know, which simply says, do you believe in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its teachings as expressed in its fundamental beliefs? So that's fundamental Adventism, whether one likes it or not. And simply by making a declaration to that effect, one satisfies the call for a baptismal vow as one of the alternatives.